Hi everyone, in today's video I'm cutting out several different pieces of fondant decorations to go on a Sweet 16 cake. I will be making a drive-in theater sign, part of a jukebox, a bow, and a neck scarf to go across the bottom of a 3-tier Sweet 16 cake. So right now I'm drawing a red arrow on this piece of red fondant that I rolled out fairly thin, and I just kind of drew it on there with a tool, and now I'm going back and cutting that out. Again, you do want this a little bit thin because you don't want it to weigh down the cake when you go to put it on there, but you don't want it so thin that it tears and rips when you handle it, because you do need to be able to go back and smooth out those edges and trim everything off like I'm doing now to really ensure a nice straight edge. If you don't have a ruler in your kitchen, you really should get one. I use this quite a bit for my fondant work, but I also use it when I'm decorating a cake and need a straight line, even when I'm just writing on a sheet cake and I want to make sure it's nice and straight. It's really, really handy. Now you see me tracing the blue arrow onto the fondant, and then I am going to cut right inside those lines because I do want it to be a little bit smaller than the red one. So I'm doing that now, and then I'll go back and clean it up because once I get it on the red arrow, I'm sure I'll have to adjust it slightly. Again, you want to go back and straighten those edges up with your ruler and cut off any pieces that are too tall or too long. And all those little frayed pieces you get when you work with fondant, you want to kind of smooth those out with your fingers and ruler as well. Now I'm going back to put that blue arrow on top of the red one. I'm going to use a little bit of water to paint that on. Be careful not to use too much water because it can create kind of a sticky mess and make your red fondant bleed a little bit. I just put a little bit on there to make it tacky, cleaned it up again, and then I'm going to set that aside and let it dry for a few hours before attaching it to the cake. This black fondant that I'm rolling out now is going to be fairly thin, similar to the fondant that I rolled out for the arrows, and I'm just drawing on there a simple pair of sunglasses. I'm not going to be doing anything too decorative on these sunglasses, just basically cutting that shape out and letting it dry overnight before I attach it to the cake. I'll go back and smooth out my edges a little bit, but really I'm just going to cut out that simple design you see there, let it dry overnight, and it'll stand up on its own once I attach it to the cake with a little bit of water. This red fondant that I'm rolling out now is going to be the bow, and that is the topper for our entire cake. So I'm going to roll this out pretty thin. It is going to look like a bow, so it needs to be thin like fabric would be or like a satin bow would be. So again, roll it out nice and thin, cut the ends off to really straighten it up so you have one long strip. And then you're going to use that to pull together the ends to create a bow shape. So I'm cleaning up my edges here, and then I'm flipping it over, and I'm really making sure it's nice and thin. So I'm going to roll back over it a few times just to make sure it's thin. Then you're going to see me add a little bit of water to the center section and both ends, and that's going to create a little bit of tackiness so I can make it stick. So I'm pulling my end over, pinching it to create a seam, and then doing that again. Again, pinching it in the middle really gives you that fabric look, so you get that nice crease. And then I'm going to cut a smaller piece out of fondant to create that loop that kind of sits over the middle of the bow there. And I'll also attach that with a little bit of water so that it closes up nicely in the back. I'm adding a crease here in the center with my tool there just to make it look more realistic. And then I'm going to set it up completely because I want to make sure it dries as it'll look on the cake. So I put my fingers through those loops there to open them back up, and then I'm going to use some extra cake dowels that I have to set in there overnight so that I'm sure it won't cave in on itself as it's drying. Now I'm going to start on the jukebox, and so I am rolling out some red fondant into a long rope, and I'm going to also do the same thing with some yellow fondant. I want them to be similar in width and in length, and I want them to be thick enough rope so they support themselves and I don't have to worry about them breaking once I pick them up. But I also want them thin enough not to weigh down the cake. So I'm going to roll those out and make sure they're the same size, and then I'm going to put them side by side to create the outside shape of the jukebox. So now I'm putting those two colors together to create that outside edge of the jukebox. I'm going to cut that to the size I need and then go back and add those other strips to the outside again because I do want it to be a little bit thicker. I don't want it to be a small tiny jukebox. I'm kind of pushing those together to create one solid piece, and then I'm going to let this dry before I add the center pieces to it to finish the decorations on it. This piece of fondant I've rolled out rather large and also very thin, and I'm going to cut out a good sized piece out of it, a long strip, because this is going to go around the entire bottom tier of the cake to create the neck scarf. I'm putting it on my mat there to guarantee it doesn't stick, and then I'm going back with my ball tool and I'm really trying to thin out those edge pieces so that it looks more like a solid piece of fabric. Now I'm going to hold this fondant piece up against the bottom of the tier and to make sure that I do have the right size I need, and then I'm going to start folding down the sides of this piece of fondant. I really feel like that gives me a 3D look with the fabric. Almost looks like there's a seam on it. So as you see, I'm just going to fold that over, add a little bit of water just to make it tacky and stick to itself, and then I'm going to apply it to the cake with a little bit of water as well. And once you do this, there will be a little bit of an open spot in the front of your cake where the two pieces of fondant do come together, the two ends, and that's okay. There's a seam there because you're also going to cut out two large teardrop shapes of red fondant to create the tails, if you want to call it that, of your bow to look like it's tied. And then I made a little knot and attached it to the front, and you can kind of see that here as I turn this cake. And on this second tier here, I am just piping a simple black buttercream bead border to finish that off. On this top tier, I chose to go with red fondant again for my border, so I'm painting a little bit of water on there with a brush, and then I just rolled out a long thin red rope of fondant and wrapped it around that base. I'm just going back with my X-Acto knife now and trimming that up and getting it nice and smooth and in place. Here is the finished cake with all the fondant pieces. I attached everything with a little bit of water, and then I steamed it in the end to really give it a nice sheen. I also made some poodle skirt cake pops, and they turned out super cute. Thanks so much for watching.